Ladies and gentlemen, let's try Games.com video. We're going to be taking a look at the indie game creation criteria and support and information available for indie developers, which Microsoft laid out back in the Developer Day conference this month. During this, we'll find out information such as bits of information regarding their SDK, a snapshot of their development environments, and also some of the perks that they can offer to indies. In addition to all of this, I've done this as an article as well, where I do go detailed explanation simply because of time and other bits and pieces. I've also put a link to the original sources, and I've also got some images in there as well. So anyway, with that said, I'm going to get some preface in, and then we can just jump into the analysis itself. So Microsoft's Xbox 360 was really where we start to see indie development start to take hold for consoles, like, for example, Geometry Wars at launch. But it's fair to say that indie development and the Xbox One wasn't necessarily best friends at one point. I'm sure you'll probably remember the news where Microsoft were constantly being berated by both indie developers as well as members of the public for their rather poor, quite frankly, treatment of indie developers. For example, the fact that they could not self-publish, they needed, say, another publisher to help them out, and so on and so on. It just wasn't really good. And this allowed Sony, to be honest with you, to swoop in and pretty much play the white knight. And it scooped up a lot of indie development simply because of that. However, times are changing, and Microsoft are definitely improving vastly, might I add, their indie development support. So, with that said, indie development, of course, isn't necessarily going to beat AAA titles, but they do coexist. And to give you an idea of what I mean by this, let's say that a month rolls around and you've got the new Assassin's Creed and Far Cry released in the same month. We're just going to throw an example out here. I know it's two really big games, but let's say you're not interested in them. It's always that possibility. Let's say you've never liked Assassin's Creed and open world shooters just aren't your thing, and you more prefer military shooters, just for example, in which case, nothing for you new this month, right? And that's where indie games come out, and you might say, oh look, Killerphone 3000's out, this looks kind of cool, and then you pick that up instead. In other words, it's always providing fresh new content. So now we've got the obvious and boring stuff out of the way, let's jump in to the present. So in June 2014, Microsoft held their annual Development Day conference, and they showed off a lot of offerings and what they're basically going to be touting to indie developers. So one of the first things, the opening statement basically in this, is you get 2 Xbox One development kits for completely free. This includes development to, so access to documentation, forums, middleware. You also get provided 1 Xbox-only Unity Pro license, as well as an add-on for Unity. Unity, just in case you're not aware, is a game engine, so a little bit like, say, Unreal Engine or the other popular ones. Unity is actually really popular with indie developers because it's pretty easy to get up and running with. You don't really need to, say, write shaders and stuff like that unless you want to do something a little bit more complicated than normal. A lot of it's just kind of baked in. It's really easy to deploy the title. So there is a little bit of mentioning here regarding the Xbox One's OS, and we'll go more into that in a moment, although I've also provided a link to where we've done an analysis regarding inside the Xbox One, which was also a discussion at the Developer Day conference, but we'll get more into that in just a moment. So, Microsoft do tout that you're going to be able to be found in a couple of locations. And those of you who are Xbox One regulars are probably going to be familiar with it. The Spotlight, the Trending, and Recommendations. Spotlight is controlled by Microsoft. Not much more to say about that. They choose what games are in the Spotlight. Trending is pretty obvious. It's basically what's popular currently with the community as a whole. And Recommendations is pretty much going a Netflix approach. So in other words, Uncle Bob likes a movie or a TV show, and it says, hey, you might like this as well. That's not to say that you can release anything on the system. There are some quality controls. Now, some of these are there to basically prevent the title from being an air control type of situation. You might remember that game released on Steam, which was just a broken, bloody mess, as well as being, well, crap. So you do have to go through some quality control measures, as well as Microsoft do point out there are some conditions or criteria of what type of studios they're looking for, but we'll go more into that in just a moment. So Microsoft also point out that you will indeed be much more noticeable than what you were traditionally on the Xbox Live Store, and Microsoft are trying to push that. Because they know basically happy indie developers as well as a happy ecosystem equals a great thing. So, to move back on to the other point, Microsoft are looking for professional indie studios. Predominantly, if you've shipped PC or mobile games, you're very desired, but it's not necessarily true that if that's the case or is not the case, you will or will not be accepted. So, for example, you might not be a professional indie studio and you might not have shipped a title on, say, the mobile or the PC, but they might like your game idea and they might say, hey, you know what, this is actually really cool, let's go for it. On the other hand, it could be the reverse. Maybe you are a professional indie studio, but they're still not interested in taking you on because maybe they feel that they've got enough of those games. In other words, the decision at the end of the day is down to them. So it's not like they're doing a free-for-all. I'll be honest, I actually kind of prefer this approach in some ways over Steam. Valve say it's not their job to police their store, which in some ways I agree with, but in another it kind of is, because at the end of the day, if a game just sucks, if it's just bad, if it's just a broken mess with so many bugs that you just feel like you've wasted the money that you've spent it on, it's not a good situation. And so I do kind of like the tighter control Microsoft have. And at the end of the day, they are a hardware manufacturer, so they do need a tighter rein on the leash than, say, the PC. Because with the PC, there is Steam. The front page of Steam is generally considered the holy grail, but that's not all there is to it. And other websites like, for example, Origin, or other services like, say, Origin, Humble Bundle, Green Man Gaming, and dozens of other websites are all happy to sell your game for you. Or, for example, it could even be on your own website. So what about software development environment? Not particularly surprising that you're going to need to be familiar with, well, Visual Studio, as well as C++ and all the other usual gubbins. Interestingly enough, Visual Studio 2013 is not supported yet, so 2012 is the de facto environment to work in. And of course, Windows 7 or 8 are required, and naturally 64-bit for the extra memory extensions. They're basically liking the whole experience to developing an application in the Windows Store. It's pretty much the same type of remote debugging and running of the application. We'll go more into that in just a moment. The operating system for the Xbox One is fairly unique. I've delved much more deeply into this in my Inside the Xbox One analysis of their development day. There is a link to that in this article, so you can go ahead and check that out. But a brief overview of this is that there's a shared partition, an exclusive partition, as well as the host OS. Now, when I say partition, they're basically separate operating systems. So in effect, there's 3 OSs. The first OS in this respect is the host OS. It's basically controlling the other 2 and just making sure everything runs okay. Then you've got the exclusive partition for the games. That's obviously got the lion's share of the memory, the lion's share of the GPU reserve, the lion's share of the CPU, and so on and so on and so on. Then there's the shared partition for the applications, the Xbox One shell, the OS and all of that, and that gets hosted basically by a different operating system entirely. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, they can't break your game. So, in other words, let's assume that they decide that they want to mess about with the system OS. They want to completely redesign it. Right? They want to update all the libraries, they want to do this, they want to do that. It doesn't matter what they want to do. Hell, they could just delete it. Well, maybe not delete it, but you get the idea. They could do some serious stuff to it. It doesn't matter, as long as they're not changing the RAM reserves and stuff like that. In other words, to affect the game OS, nothing's going to happen. So this means that if you've developed a title 3 months down the line, 12 months down the line, 24 months down the line, 36 months down the line later, the game will still work, which is a really important thing. The other reason they've done this is let's assume that the title does crash. Unlikely, because they do have quality control, but at the end of the day, it's not inconceivable a title can crash. Well, in theory, and theory isn't necessarily equal to it won't, but theoretically it's a lot less likely to take the rest of the Xbox One with it. In other words, you should be able to quit out the application, simply because it is running in a separate OS. And this is, if you're familiar at all with any virtual machine type of stuff, then you'll be pretty familiar with how all of this works. If you need more information on virtual machine, you could search VirtualBox on the channel. Just go to the channel search and type in VirtualBox, and I go into some in-depth explanations. You could also search Windows Azure as well, and I also go into explanations to how Microsoft's Windows Azure technology with its virtual machines work as well. So moving on to the Xbox One and XTF, I'll repeat that one more time, Xavier, Tommy, Frank tools. There are a couple of them. There's the XB Remote Recovery, which basically restores various Xbox Live updates from a development PC to the development kit. This is pretty self-explanatory. It basically means that the latest APIs, the latest SDK, and basically the latest updates for the Xbox One are installed so they can utilize it as necessary. So for example, let's say you've got your Xbox One and you don't have the latest update to unlock the extra 10% GPU reserve. This will allow you to do that. So in other words, it allows you to basically have the updated firmwares. The next one is XTF API, which is basically allows you to create and develop your own API tools to work with if you've got specific requirements based on either your studio or your project and so on. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated now. The first one would be XB Deploy. In case you're wondering, XB obviously stands for Xbox. So XB Deploy is basically a little bit like, what could I liken it to? Like a map to drive in some respects. It pretty much is the method to put the title on the development kit. So it can operate in two methods, either push or pull. Push is slower. It basically means that you have to move all of the files over to the development Xbox One. So you can't play the title until all of the files are copied over. So if you happen to make changes to, say, the textures, the lighting, the game's code, whatever, it could be a 1 kilobyte change. It doesn't make a difference. All of the files need to be copied over. And that's pretty much it. It's perfect, however, for demo booth situations. So let's say, for example, you want to take this out, you need to show it on the road or whatever. That's why this exists primarily, or you just want to actually play the game properly and start doing a lot of serious testing. The next option, however, is a little bit more conducive to, say, continuous development, and that would be pull. So rather than pushing the data to the Xbox One is actually pulling the data from the development kit. It basically means that you need a consistent connection. So this is very much like if you've ever mapped a network folder, or, for example, if you've ever used the internet. So, for example, if you go to a website, say redgamingtech.com, and you want to do anything, you're basically pulling data from the server, right? So a server somewhere hosts data. We're actually using Windows Azure to host a lot of our stuff. Basically, a server somewhere is holding the data, and your computer wants to connect to it. It needs to go to that page. If you go to a different page that you've not been to, in other words, the browser hasn't cached it, it will pretty much pull new data from the server. The same principle applies here. You just need to copy over the main exe, and then the game could basically work from there. It will obviously pull the data as required. There's reasons behind this. So, for example, let's say you need to consistently make changes to the code. Let's say you're doing changes to, say, level design. Let's say you're saying, oh, okay, well, I don't like the look of this building here, I need to move it over there, and I need to maybe add a couple of extra bad guys in this level, because they're not really offering a challenge. The players are just walking past, and this guy here is just shooting into a wall half the time, so let's definitely move him. And then you say, you know what, I think he still needs to go over 3 inches, and I think, you know what, I think I'm going to actually add a grenade there. And this is all dynamic. This is dynamic development. This is an instance where you'd actually want to use this type of situation, because you're going to consistently want to make small changes rather than needing to make big sweeping changes, and it's just not really a good idea to, well, have to copy over a bunch of code every time. Rather obviously, however, you may need to compile your title as well. Anyway guys, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you found it somewhat interesting. It's a little bit different to what we normally do in RGT, but I figured it would be a good look into the mind of indie development, and at least a basic understanding of what the conditions, criteria are, and so on for the Xbox One. Anyway, I thought, yeah, I found it interesting anyway, I won't lie. So hopefully you do as well. Anyway, normal stuff, if you could share, like, and all the other usual bits and bobs, I would be very grateful indeed. Anyway, hopefully I'll see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.